Welcome back, everyone. My name is Emily Stokes-Rees, and I'm the Interim Director of the School of Design at Syracuse University and a professor in the graduate program in Museum Studies. I want to briefly mention our graduate student behind the scenes, Kelsey Olney-Wall, who will be fielding the Q&A this session. Thank you, Kelsey. I'd also like just to take a moment to remind everyone that live captioning is available, and also that every session is being recorded for future viewing and will be made available to all registered participants in the weeks to come. We ask you to please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask questions, and note that we will not be individually identifying anyone who poses a question in the hopes that this might encourage greater participation. Finally, due to the number of participants, it's likely that we won't be able to get to all of your queries, but we will do our best to address as many as we can. Our next session is called The Impermanence of Objects and Museums, and will be moderated by Stefanie Jandl. Stefanie is an author and former curator, and most recently, she is the co-editor of Collections and Deaccessioning in a Post-Pandemic World, a 3-volume collection to be published this spring. Welcome, Stefanie.
Thank you, and welcome to the 3rd session. At the heart of discussions about deaccessioning are ideas about permanence, that museums and the collections they hold are forever, or something close to that. This session, which was inspired by the work of our 3 panelists, will dig into these ideas to consider how they inform contemporary views about museums and museum practice. We'll also look at whether and how ideas of permanence and impermanence should be reframed for our post-2020 world. Let me introduce our panelists. Amy Whitaker is a faculty member in arts administration at New York University and brings an unusual perspective to deaccessioning, having worked both in art museums, the Guggenheim, MoMA, and the Tate, as well as an investment management firm, D.E. Shaw and Company. We have Michael Conforti, Director Emeritus of the Clark Art Institute in Williamstown, Massachusetts, and an adjunct professor in the Williams College graduate program in the history of art. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Stephen Lubar, Professor of American Studies at Brown University. He writes and teaches on museums and museum history. Thank you all for being here. Let's start with you, Steve. Your work has focused on a wide range of museums and collections. Why is art special among accessioned objects in museums?
Thanks for the question, and I'm delighted to be here. Like many of you, it's been a fascinating morning to learning about the wide world of deaccessioning. The question of art museums as compared to other museums is something that I'm interested in. My background is in history and anthropology museums. So art museums seem in some ways a rather different world, but there might be things that can be learned from those comparisons. The thing that struck me when I first started to be involved a little bit with art museums was just how much the market is a part of the thinking in art museums. All museums are part of some sort of market ecosystem, but it's the art museums where, well, nothing else, the money is much bigger. The prices of art are high and it gets our attention. It's also a complex market where the work of art museums, the work of curators can drive the prices of things. There's a long tradition in art museums of curators assisting patrons with their collections. So there's a sense that money is more important and that the market is more important in art museums. But there are a couple of things that I think might be some interesting overlaps and maybe directions forward for art museums from looking at history museums or anthropology museums. History museums, of course, tend not to have enormously valuable objects, but what they do have is generally a very close connection to their community. They're smaller, they're more local many times, and they have a sense of usefulness that I keep coming back to as the central thing for museums to keep in mind, that they need to be useful to their communities. I'd call attention here to the recent manifesto for active history museum collections, which basically said, if your collections aren't useful, if they don't advance your mission, you should get rid of them. So thinking about how collections reflect your mission, rather than how maybe your mission is driven by your collections, is something that perhaps history museums could contribute to the conversation. Anthropology museums have a different set of issues. There, I'd call attention to NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, passed in 1990, basically saying that museums that hold Native American collections need to repatriate those in certain categories, complicated set of rules about what should be repatriated. When that was passed in 1990, there was an enormous uproar in the museum world. This will destroy our collections. This will mean that we no longer will be able to tell these stories. And in fact, it's been good for museums. It's been good for anthropology museums. It's made for much stronger connections with the communities that those collections came from. And it's made for a much stronger way of telling much better stories that can be told because of those connections. So the usefulness and the connections to communities are two things that I would think about as ways that art museums might learn from their poor cousins, the history and anthropology museums.
Great, and I'm hoping we can pick up a little bit more about NAGPRA a little later in the conversation. So I'd like to ask you, Michael, a question focused on art museums. And that is, so you've written about the importance of collections and also places where impermanence in a very limited and judicious way can be a good thing. So I'm wondering if you can tell us about what the parameters are of non-permanence. In an ever-evolving institution, what objects are deaccessionable?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Stefanie. I'm going to take a little time. I'm going to be a little bit historical. I'll offer a couple of personal perspectives, but I ask for your patience as I really tell you a few stories of things the way they happen in times past. I'd start by putting a frame around the United States. I mean, it is unusual, given the ease with which we regularly utilize the acts of deaccessioning. We don't have a cultural ministry. Many countries have cultural ministries that don't allow or strongly discourage deaccessioning, as collections are considered part of cultural patrimony. Kayvin said this morning, that exists in certain places in the United States, the National Gallery or her museum, but it's not a common practice. For the most part, we operate in the States with a kind of ideological pragmatism when it comes to dealing with history and tradition generally. And it's not inappropriate that works can flow in and out of museums more easily than in other places. That's just a point I would make in starting. But that being said, and leaving the issue of the use of deaccessioning funds aside, which is really what's brought us here today, it's the question of the moment seemingly, but we're going to leave that question off for a moment. There really are no generalizations that one can make regarding how museums should address the issue and what should be permanent. The policies regarding deaccessioning have to do with be addressed in the context of the kind of museum that you are. While every collecting museum to a degree is engaged in some form of preservation and study. The relative emphasis varies between museums. I personally could argue, for the purposes of this discussion, since you're asking for my personal views, that there are some places that are probably more logically kept permanent. I'll mention the Garden Museum. We heard Courtney talk about it earlier. They did actually break the will once when they sold a group of Chinese objects. They were looking for space for programming, and they sold objects. But those kinds of museum narratives about the taste of a founding collector, if that's your story, Frick, you might be an example, possibly Stephen, historical houses. There may be a case for no deaccessioning in that context because the context is part of the narrative of the story. On the other hand, in a very different way, there are those, while we don't actually have encyclopedic museums, it's one of my pet peeves, we keep using the term, but there is no museum encyclopedia. We're representative institutions in large part with aspirations to being encyclopedic, but there are places that come close. The Smithsonian comes close in certain ways. The closer to an art museum parallel would be the Victoria and Albert Museum in Britain, and places like that. You can ask, does the library have too many books? Does the V&A have too many textiles, prints and drawings? Indeed, can the Smithsonian have too many fossils in its collections? And I think if funders, if governments in this case, want to continue to support those kinds of institutions for those truly nearly encyclopedic resources for scholars and interested collectors, I think there's a case for no deaccessioning in that context. But that leaves virtually all other museums, and certainly here in the States. And when I started to write on the subject, some decades ago, 30 years ago, there was a strong tradition of, and it still is around, quality improvement of collections within the canon that drove most of the deaccessioning. And there were and still are many examples of such deaccessioning. Indeed, it's probably the majority of the deaccessioning that happens, selling 2 or 3 objects perceived as lesser quality and buying often, but not necessarily within the same category. There are some, better objects, and there are some institutions in the past who actually used to require the purchases to remain within the departments in which the objects were deaccessioned. So you only could use those funds within prints and drawings if you sold prints and drawings and the rest of that. That doesn't happen so much anymore, but it was once a trend. Now in that world, the issues were often one of tactics, or whether you had a potential tactical mistake. If the marketplace disagreed with the opinion of the institution, the objects that the institution thought were little value actually had value as they transitioned into the marketplace. Things that might have been thought to be fakes by the institution were then seen in the marketplace to be real, or objects having little interest in one geography having a greater interest in a different geography, and the institution was unaware of it. And then as now, and this is more of a general recommendation for asset oversight, you really never sell objects that you don't really understand and know well. And if you don't have the expertise inside, you find it, and never sell something that you don't fully understand. Although that's not actually an issue of permanence. It's something I'm choosing to remind people out there to remember, because asset management is part of your responsibility. Now, so tactics aside, permanence aside for a moment, the U.S. is unusual among countries, and they're in 2 general ways in the way in which they choose to deaccession, assuming that other places even attempt. and there, and I would raise two general traditions here that you don't find really anywhere else. One is the process of institutional transformation. One notable example that doesn't get cited often, although it's certainly in people are conscious of it, is the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis. T.B. Walker established a museum there in the late teens. The collection was mixed in terms of quality and authenticity. Realizing this in mid-century, the trustees began a process of deaccessioning everything, and I mean everything, that T.B. Walker had. And it took over, they did it over a 30-year period, but in the process, the institution transformed itself into a significant museum of contemporary art that still is that, with the purchasing power stemming from those early sales that went into acquisitions endowments. Now, another and more recent and much discussed example was the 2007 decision on the part of the trustees of the Albright Knox Gallery to sell all of its historical collections, to concentrate on 20th and 21st century art, where strength that history had bestowed on it. And that choice was much maligned at the time, often by those brought up in Buffalo who remember the educational value that those earlier objects in the collection had for them, growing up at a time when the museum attempted to collect examples of different objects from different periods as part of a kind of educational representative of past times and past cultures. Another practice worth talking about right now, because it seems to be very much alive at the moment, is that of selling high value works to pay for a different category of objects currently not part of the museum holdings. Either to change the canon or to add a canon. The Guggenheim in 1990 wasn't exactly the first to engage in this practice. It's been around earlier. The much maligned earlier Adelaide de Groot sales of the late 60s, early 70s during Hoving's tenure was a case of selling valued objects to change canons. But the Guggenheim sales commanded a lot of headlines at the time, as selling a Kandinsky, a Modigliani, a Chagall to buy the Panza collection of late 20th century art. And $47 million were raised at that time. Again, it was criticized on the basis of the high quality of what was sold and the relationship of what was sold to the history of the collections of that particular institution. Now, this, of course, this is the practice that we're many critics are focusing on now. SF MoMA selling the Rothko to fund canon rebalancing with gender and racial equity goals. We all know about the Baltimore was part of this, indeed Syracuse, and the sale of the Pollock is all are well-known examples of all of this. And I suppose it goes without saying to this audience, because we're so deeply involved in this issue, that these issues are really quite aside from the perspective of the organizations that set standards for museums in this country where there isn't a cultural ministry, and that's the AAM and AMD and AMC. Any of these sales are permissible, even though they might be criticized, they're permissible as the funds stay within the category of collection enhancement or care. Now, I'd close by repeating what's already been said in earlier presentations from Michael O'Hare to many others, that these decisions are part of the history of the institution, that deaccessions, and they represent the values of a particular time and place. Time indeed reveals whether the current notion of impermanence, whether the current ambitions in collection enhancement through selling is going to be judged positively in time's future, but that's okay. I mean, collections evolve based on the attitudes of one moment in time, both in accessioning and deaccessioning. That's one of the ways in which museums are vital and ever-changing institutional organisms, and we should celebrate that and not not wine.
Thank you, Michael, for outlining the case for certain kinds of deaccessioning. That was really clear and very helpful. And that also paves the way to ask Amy a question about something very intriguing that you've written about, and that is what is the good death of an object in a museum?
Thank you very much, Stefanie. And thanks to you and Mark and Syracuse and the organizers, and very honored to be in conversation with Steve and Michael and everyone else. So this idea of the good death of the museum, the good death of the object, but also as proxy for dealing with existential human questions and even institutional questions, came about from an essay that I wrote for the book Stefanie and Mark have edited. I co-authored it with Adam Glick, and the title of the essay is Object Impermanence, which is meant to evoke the sort of toddler development stage where if you cover your eyes and you can't see someone, you think that they've disappeared. And just to talk about what it is to conceptualize artworks as having potential permanence outside of an institution or life beyond deaccessioning, and in short, how to think of deaccessioning as a systems problem. I know that's a facile thing to say, especially from the perspective of someone who writes and teaches and is not currently tasked with the enormously difficult work of managing a cultural organization. And I think that work is difficult for a reason that's at the core of what we're talking about and at the core of what it is to talk about a quote unquote good death of an object. So the way I would describe that is to start with the work of a sociologist called Viviana Zelizer. In 1978, Zelizer wrote an article about life insurance policies in the 19th century and the way in which people were at first deeply uncomfortable buying them because life seemed sacred and equating it to money in any way, shape, or form seemed profane. This investigation led to a body of research for which Zelizer is very well known, this idea of how we reconcile economic and other forms of value. For her, it's the commercial and the intimate sphere. So the economics of children, marriage, and what she describes as circuits of commerce, how money circulates among these realms. And as many people in the audience probably know, the cultural sociologist Olav Velthus adopted this work to the arts. And it's a larger kind of philosophical debate between nothing but and hostile worlds ways of conceptualizing artistic and economic value. So in the hostile world's view, art and economics or markets must be kept completely distinct because markets will taint art. And in the nothing but view, economics is a perfect barometer and all forms of value are legible by price. And the sort of circuits of commerce view is that these things have to come together. So when I say that managing a museum looks incredibly difficult, I think I say that with great sincerity because unlike managers of large corporations, who of course have to manage for multiple forms of value and exist in communities and in communities of people, museum directors are currently asked to think about their staff, their buildings, their collection, artistic stewardship, and also financial management. In addition, at a time when we, in a positive way, are grappling with a sort of decolonial reconsideration of the histories of museums and kind of equity repair work with regard to the communities around museums. And so I sometimes think about what the mood of the conversation is, how different it might have felt to build highway systems, in the 1950s relative to repairing highway systems now. And also as part of the repair work, having to deal with difficult truths like highways that cut through neighborhoods of poorer communities or Black and brown communities, and what it is to engage in that work. So when Adam and I are writing about the good death of an artwork, we imagine that might involve deaccessioning as a system of care that's more deeply connected to collecting works, that's an acknowledgement of a period of expansion, like a highway system, in which there are just tons of objects in museums, and that it can be extremely important to keep all of them, but in the act of examining them, there might be ways in which some objects take life beyond the museum. So they become impermanent to the museum, but still exist in the world. And that could be through decolonial processes of returning objects to communities. That could be through separating the care of the physical object from maintaining rigorously the scholarly resources around it, including through digital systems. And it can also mean sort of shifting to what it is for museums to focus on betterment. And in the opening keynote that Kaywin gave, the idea that museums have expanded architecturally is an example of getting bigger, while there may be ways of thinking about getting better or staying focused. And just to acknowledge the deeply human work of judgment and what it is to relax what the AAMD rule has done, which is to create a fixed firewall between artistic and financial value, and what it is to say, actually, instead of having this kind of fixed support, what does it mean for us to engage in the judgment and the vulnerability and risk of having to constantly think about why we care for these objects. So I think that's a very difficult human kind of work. And that's why I think Adam and I phrased it that way with regard to like how existential the question really is.
It's a fascinating and important perspective to be thinking about the life of the object as extending beyond the museum. And let's turn for an historical perspective. Steve, so your collaborative work at the Jenks Museum at Brown University, the Lost Jenks Museum, addresses the history of museums from a different direction than we normally look at it. That is, from a museum that that ended, that was closed, that failed. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about what past museum closures can teach us today about museum practice and keeping museums thriving.
I'll say a little bit about the Jenks Museum and then try to generalize it a bit, because one thing that I've learned is that we remember the museums that survive, that are still around. The more you look, the more extinct museums you find. But just a bit about the museum at Brown University. In 1870, Brown University president got a letter from an alumnus named John Whipple Potter Jenks saying, "You can't be a real university unless you have a museum," which I think probably meant Harvard has a museum, you need one too. And he offered to come and bring his collection and build a museum for the university. He was a retired school teacher. He'd been a collector for other institutions for a long time. And Brown gave him a building. And for about 30 years until his death, the university had a thriving small university museum, partly natural history collections, partly what we would now call today an anthropology collection, a portrait collection, and then independent but nearby, what was very common for 19th century art museums, a collection of plaster casts of classical sculpture. Almost all of this has disappeared. The plaster casts, as with so many museums, went out of fashion. And thinking about how objects go in and out of fashion, I guess it's part of our larger conversation, but plaster casts are one of those examples where they were what big city museums did. They were what university museums did. And by 1920 or so, just no longer interesting. Back to the Jenks Museum though, Jenks was a professor of biology. The museum was mostly used by biology department, history department, geology department. There was no art history department yet, but that would have been coming towards the end. But when Professor Jenks died, in good curatorial fashion, died going up the steps of his museum, he had not done a good job of making the museum useful to the larger community. He hadn't kept good records. He hadn't brought other faculty members to be involved with it as much as he should have been. But most important, what he hadn't done was to keep up with the changing teaching at university. There's university teaching in biology and natural history was changing from looking at taxidermied objects to doing laboratory work. And what quickly happened was that the museum objects were pushed first to the sides of the rooms to bring in a lab benches. And then the natural history collections, after being put in the basement for a while and scattered about the university campus, were eventually put into the university dump on the grounds that, and this will be amusing to the lawyers in the audience, we promised to keep these things on university property forever. It turns out we have a dump on the bank of the Seekonk. We'll just put it in the river there and be done with it. Probably not good legal advice. But the anthropological collections turned out to be put into a attic, and many years later, when Brown actually started its own anthropology museum, almost by accident, they were rediscovered, and some of those ended up in the museum today. So this long, complicated history of a museum founded in an enthusiastic moment, disappeared when it's no longer useful to the community that needs it, and pieces of it then either lost forever or eventually rediscovered and put back into circulation as museum objects. One of the things I've discovered since working on this project at Brown is that almost every university has some similar story. There were many, many museums and universities that disappeared. And in fact, there's been some wonderful exhibition projects as students and faculty have worked to rediscover those university museums. The next piece of this, though, is that if you start looking, you can find that museums go out of business much more than we would think. Again, we remember the ones that survive. We try to forget the ones that don't. So thinking about museums having a life cycle and then doing some analysis about what makes them go out of business, what allows them to thrive, what suggests that they'll fail, seems like a really important piece of work to do right now when we're told that as many as a third of museums might be have a chance of going out of business.
Can I say something in response to Amy? There's just one thing that needs to say as a former head of AMD, when you talk about AMD guidelines, it gets my back up, so I'm going to make a comment. I understand museums well enough to know that they're a 250-year-old organization. They don't necessarily have to be here, forever. And we could make a choice as a society over time that they don't have to exist. But the AMD firewall is not what's keeping that from happening. That's simply that's a series of assumptions based on the existence of these organizations in the charitable framework of the United States that gives them a raison d'etre of how to operate. But that's not keeping them from non-existing.
Yeah.
And that's a different conversation. And we may be going that way. I mean, Joseph Rickwork used to talk about this in the 70s and 80s. Everything should be a deaccession, go back to the marketplace. We're certainly seeing repatriation and restitution claims that would have that as a version of a goal. But that's it's a different conversation. It's not the AMD guidelines.
No, I thank you. I really appreciate that, Michael. And I agree with you. I don't think what I mean to say is that the AAMD guidelines allow a situation in which artworks, if they, and please correct me if I'm wrong, and I've already learned tremendously from reading your own work and the Stephen Weil work you also shared with us. So I agree with you completely that there are these kind of FASB guidelines and nonprofit charitable law in the United States. And that you may know far more than I do about that as a motivation for the AAMD rules. But from my standpoint, as someone who studies the economics of works of art and commensuration and sociological kind of ideas of how art and money coexist, my impression, and I could be wrong, is that the AAMD rule as it was makes it so that if an artwork leaves an institution, if it is converted into money, the money doesn't really come back to the institution until it is converted into artwork. So in a way, artwork is converted into other artwork, because if something is deaccessioned, it can only be used for acquisition. And this change in the rules creates a lot of complexity around the financial nature of art. And I would say that one of the reasons it's really important to talk about is that if we don't talk about it, it's possible that suddenly the space between the artistic and financial value will crash, and the $15 million that a board member of a major urban center museum gives to the museum every year, and is not seen as financialized because it's in a philanthropic realm, will actually start to come into the collection if those rules change and works can be more immediately financialized. And that, to me, there's a very hopeful conversation about the role of human judgment and of digging into the gray area and the complexity of it, in order to kind of keep the museum not even alive in a monitors in a hospital room sense, but alive in a very robust human sense. That I, as somebody for whom museums are a first love, including the Clark and many others, I'm very hopeful for that, and hopeful for the sort of weaving in of economics as a reality of all of us being human beings in a market society and institutions in a market society, as opposed to a resistance of it where all of a sudden it's kudzu that's kind of grown over everything. But I absolutely, I defer 100% to your knowledge of the AAMD. Oh my goodness.
I want to make sure that we want to go down this path. Stefanie, we could go in this direction, and I could have be as far less articulate than Amy in responding, but is this what you want the panel to talk about?
I think we're all intrigued. I'd love to hear your response.
Well, I mean, God, there's so many things to say. So certainly and this may not be addressing it directly enough, Amy, and I apologize for that, but certainly the financial value of the works of art are always part of the consciousness of the museum, and I'm not sure you're not saying that, but I would say that it is indeed the use of that money that is at play here, if you will, but the museum is always making decisions based on its financial assets, and that includes assets of works of art. The point I was making about the sale of very valuable works in order to change the canon, et cetera, et cetera. I'm going to slightly change this topic slightly, if you don't mind, but it may be useful, both if not for this panel, for other panels. Kaywin this morning, I think, was very articulate on why we've gotten to this point of thinking as broadly as possible about financial resources in light of the issues we face: equity issues, environmental issues, the fact that we're very conservative organizations. There are three other factors I would bring up in a slightly more mundane fashion that I think has moved us to this point where it's, as I often think of, collections or community. We've the change in prepositions, if we will. We used to talk about collections and audience. Stephen Weil and Elaine Gurian, I hope she's on, reminded us that collections were for audience. We now seem to be talking about collections or community as though there was a choice. I think the reason why we've gotten to this point is that for three reasons. I think there's culturally a sort of dissatisfaction with the idea of storage. See it in Michael O'Hare's view, but he's not alone. I think collectors who've started their own museums are frequently people who don't want to see objects in storage. Eli Broad and others, they want to make sure their objects are. There's a dislike for the notion of storage, even though you do see certain institutions thrive because of the depths of storage. The new MoMA, with all of its many-fold curatorial interpretations, would not be that organization without a lot of objects in storage. So, but we don't like the idea of storage. I'm one who, if I could share Michael O'Hare's view, I think we ought to do a lot more sharing of collections, if not selling of collections, but more sharing of collections. That being the case, the other factor is that unlike what Stephen has outlined, those natural history collections, the smaller collections that have no particular value, are the objects that we are there to care for have market value, and that market value is always in the minds of trustees and the public generally. That's promoted in the media. So it's very hard for the public to separate those objects in our care from the objects and from the other assets that we have. I think that's just a tough one. So that when you bring up the third factor, the factor of philanthropy in this context, the fact that people give objects for charitable use with a special IRS tax deduction, the fact that FASB looks at only the use of objects for other collections or certain care of collections, conservatively defined, and how that plays into the reality that that undermining that affects our philanthropic purpose. And I think philanthropy is something that's not been enough discussed in this context. It should be discussed in the context of the alternative of the Berkshire Museum, which came up a lot during the day. It certainly is a foundation issue in the conservative attitudes that art museum directors have regarding the change of standards, that the charitable use purpose of their organization, the philanthropic purpose, is undermined. If you can claim $3 billion on your asset sheet, why should anyone give you money? So these are the things I would say very broadly as a response. It's not a direct response, Amy, but it's a broad response to your very thoughtful comments as well. But personally, if we never have museums again, I mean, I can live with that because I won't be alive.
I really appreciate the contextualization in philanthropy. I mean, down to the gentleman that Steve has described, who lost his life running up the steps of the museum. I think the sort of donation is really an interesting context. And I hope we still have museums, because where else will people get bored and tired and feel embarrassed to admit it? I'm kidding. Or have favorite works of art, like those in the Clark or many other museums that one can go visit. So, but sorry, Stefanie, I think you were jumping in.
Are we getting carried away, Stefanie? I apologize.
I had joked beforehand that I would like throw down the gauntlet of a Zoom emoji reaction, like, oh yeah, I raised you a party hat. I disagree. But I mean, I think they're just really important questions, and they're very charged, and there's such asymmetric information, and also such vastly different kind of stakeholder interests. And I'll say one thing before I throw it back your way, Stefanie. I've been thinking a lot about what Michael O'Hare said earlier, in the context of Kaywin Feldman's remarks too, But when he was talking about opportunity cost, unless I'm misremembering the person on the panel, and I think opportunity cost is really interesting because, you know, it manifests as a transactional kind of comparative cost to benefit kind of thought. Like, if I weren't sitting here right now, what else would I be doing? If I didn't store this work, what would that free up? But I think actually it's an invitation to sort of radical forms of imagination around alternate universes. Like, is this a world in which we no longer have museums? Or what is possible if we do this? And it becomes really complicated because everything is a kind of moving target. So you're not like 5 apples and 3 oranges, which is hard enough to compare. And so I feel like that is only more intensified by the philanthropic environment.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if I might throw in a question here.
Please.
To extend something that both of you have talked about, and that's, you know, we tend to think either our collections are in use in our museum or in storage in our museum, or, you know, and that's as far as we go, or we sell them. But I wonder if, when we think about the impermanence of collections, whether thinking about much more aggressive loans, sharing between museums might be an in-between stage between that. We have to have our own collection or we don't have a collection at all. And I'm thinking of the museum loan network from 20 years ago, which tried hard to share collections among museums. And just recently, the Art Bridges organization that is really pushing hard to say, you know, big museums, maybe you should be lending things to small museums. In this morning's discussion, the notion of, in Houston, I think, of we will have collections that belong to the museum but are on display in hospitals or schools, or lots of possibilities there about sort of blurring the edges between a permanent collection and that is in the building and for use all the time, and not getting rid of it but making it more useful in other ways. And I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on those things.
Well, I'm happy to. Do you want me to start? It's something I care about a lot. It's something I write about. I've thought a lot about why the museum art loan network didn't work, but we may be in a different state now if we had leadership within the field to actually think differently. Where there's a stronger notion of collective stewardship versus specific institutional ownership that is kind of part of the consciousness of museums now. And this is particularly true in the world of objects that imperial museums have from colonial countries. And I think there's been an effort on the part of the British Museum and other places to think about sharing in certain ways. But we don't seem to have a lot of leadership in the art museum community right now. It's a great opportunity actually for museums with huge assets and storage, and there's a lot of possibility there if people wanted to address it. And I think, for me, looking at museums generally, with all of this talk about deaccessioning, I only wish that as much energy could be put into questions like this, and the question of deaccessioning for what purpose or not.
But I feel like that is, in a way, recasting the question of deaccessioning more broadly as a question of kind of collective stewardship and care of works and collective prioritization of access to works at the same time. So it's like a permanent but porous collection, and then a sort of set of relationships where the work can be sent out into the community. And I think one of the things I've been thinking about a lot in this conversation and in general is the criticism of deaccessioning that museums are libraries, and therefore, how dare they? And I've been thinking about it. I love an analogy. I think a museum is not a library, but a book. And as somebody who's just finished writing a 3rd book, it is so difficult to figure out what stays in a book and what leaves a book. And if you're lucky, the people who read it will never know how much you struggled. But also by that same token, there's some books that are private and you buy a copy. And if you have a large book that does aspire to be encyclopedic as a book, maybe you open source it and maybe you do share it. Maybe you give open access licenses to organizations, and maybe there are ways that that can help form the sort of network. But I've always felt that museums are in the same position collaborating that artists are, where it's so economically difficult to be in a state of practice and the situation conspires to make you approach it individually, that it's very hard to kind of like put the periscope up and look around and see who else is in your same situation, up to and including internalizing the difficulties of the economic management as shame, which is inherently isolating, or pride, or sort of like, I have to make a building because I can. And so I think that's really exciting, and an idea of the sort of porousness of the museum and the sharing of the museum collection. And I think you start to see that, like the new museum exchange, where people who want to donate works can list them and museums can kind of express interest in collecting them. I mean, I think you start to see some of those efforts, and maybe technology supports them. But I think that sounds great.
That's a perfect segue into an audience question, which is about your perspectives on co-ownership of objects in collections. I think Kaywin actually mentioned one between Boston and another museum this morning. So what do you think about those as a potential model?
Well, that's an accessioning model, and it's been done by many institutions. It relates less to the issue of the accessioning, however, and therefore it's another opportunity in collection formation, the division of the acquisition assets. You see it in the contemporary world a lot when there are very large scale installations that they're shared, sometimes internationally. The clock, great, was an extraordinary video of Christian Markley, and it could only be shown in certain places, and more than one institution bought it because you couldn't show it all the time in one place. There was a Minneapolis, Iowa joint accessioning of a Grant Wood painting once. I mean, they're not uncommon, but for me, it's not an essential part of the conversation of deaccession. But it's part of the broader conversation of how we look at things differently in terms of ownership. And I think that's the exciting thing that's come out of this little engagement here, which reflects, I think, an attitude in the profession broadly, and it should simply be done more. There needs to be leaders in the field here, and I would encourage people to begin thinking about it again, as the Museum Loan Network did, as our Bridges is doing, but institutions can do it as well. The other thing I would say about book, I mean, if you take your metaphor of book and then just translate that to exhibition, what you're doing is actually creating constantly books within your galleries based on the would-be encyclopedia of the storage their curatorial access. And I would dare say the Breuer Whitney years ago never had a permanent collection gallery. It was about the showing of very specific temporary exhibitions, often from the permanent collection. It clearly, I've already said, it's the motivation of MoMA. It was Nick Sirota's Tate in the 80s and 90s. It's the ambition of Michael Govan in the new LACMA. I mean, it's the idea that your resources are there, but you don't deal with them in a rote way, kind of showing everything way. And that's still, and I guess the problem of that, in light of our conversation, is you can only do it if you're a large enough museum with deep enough collections in order to be able to have those kinds of curatorial books.
Yeah.
We put another layer into this, where we're talking about a collections sharing that originates with a work of art in a museum's collection where a 50% stake, say, is deaccessioned. and picked up by another museum. How does that model potentially look? Which is essentially what happened with the Fisk Museum in Crystal Bridges once it worked through the court system and so forth.
Yeah. I think that is very interesting, deaccessioning kind of fractionally to other museums. And I think it's important to look at, because if it doesn't happen, there's risk of deaccessioning fractionally in a financial way, like through NFTs or something like that. So I think it's an important part of this kind of, like, to invoke a cliche, it takes a village way of caring for works of art. So I agree with what Michael's saying. It's really fascinating to watch museums collaborate in collecting, especially digital works. But you can also imagine, let's say I am the museum party, I have a bunch of stuff, I might need to deaccession, but I'm nervous to do it because I'm not positive. So I agree with what Michael said, that I should therefore just like keep it if I'm not sure. But you could also engage in these kind of partial deals. So I'm thinking here of the artist William Palhaida, who has a store to own contract that I helped him with, because he decided that he, in this cost benefit trade-off, wanted the studio space instead of the storage space taken up by carrying all of his own physical work. And so it's a contract between the artist and a friend where you agree to take care of the work for 5 years. And then after 5 years, if you still have it, you become an owner. But then there's an agreement that if you ever sell it onward, you split the proceeds with the artist 50-50. And then there's a resale royalty provision beyond that. And so I think you can come up with these sort of cooperative models where there's optionality. So I, give the work to Steve. Maybe I stipulate that Steve shows it. Maybe I don't, but Steve takes care of it. And then either it comes back to me, because in year 4, I'm like, oh my goodness, I didn't mean to give that away, a feeling all of us know from our kind of, annual clothing closet overhaul. But then it can come back to me, or it can go on into the world. I can choose to keep the digital record of it. We can both keep the digital record of it. I can keep the archival papers around it if I happen to have a library in my museum. And I think that sort of like way of thinking would be very interesting to explore.
I wonder
I think, oh, so sorry, Stephen, you were going to say something.
I just was going to raise a question that was touched on briefly earlier about how, one of the sessions this morning, about how museums have made the rules for sharing and borrowing and lending objects so difficult. The insurance values, the packing, there's a long list of the complications of doing this kind of lending and sharing. But I wanted to push that discussion just a bit further. Museums have made the caring of collections very, very expensive. There's talk in museum studies classes, we talk about the Rembrandt rule, the notion that everything has to be treated like a Rembrandt. And history museums have worked hard to sort of say, well, maybe that's not true. Maybe we don't need to have that same standard. I wonder if, as with insurance in the discussion this morning, whether there aren't ways that museums could sort of ratchet down the care requirements so that these lending could happen, so that the the fractional take care of this for a while could happen at reasonable price. Are there transactional costs that we could make lower and make this happen more easily?
Well, I'm going to have 2 responses to this, one was brought up by Augustine this morning, that the pandemic, in the course of the pandemic, we've learned that we can send works of art around the world, overseeing them through video and digital in ways that we don't have to carry them personally from place to place. I would say that I don't want to endorse this necessarily, but a change in the sense of responsibility, Amy and Steve, towards the care of collections would have to be part of that in order to see it realized. I mean, one of the things that have been offered in times past is whether you could take objects from a collection and then loan it out to private individuals for a fee. And and the reaction back from the registraral side of the museum and conservative side is that you no longer have it in your care, and and what is your fiduciary responsibility to an object that is no longer in your care. That it's just an issue that maybe time. If we look on it in the course of time, attitudes will change. But that's where we've been, and as Kaywin says this morning, we're fairly conservative as institutions, and we don't change that easily. And that's one of the core professional responsibilities that is embedded in the professionalization of museums. But it doesn't mean it couldn't happen in the future.
Okay, we're actually getting close to the end of our session, but there's a question here from the audience that I'd like to pose, and it's actually directed to you, Stephen, although others may want to chime in. How does this idea of impermanence of objects work within the sphere of history museums? Wondering if you can comment on that.
Be happy to take a crack at that. Traditionally, history museums have tried to keep their objects forever, to act like art museums. There has been a real movement in the last decade or so to think about history objects in different ways. One is this way of thinking about the Rembrandt rule, that not all objects in a history museum are Rembrandts. Historic house museums, which make up a large percentage of the history museums, want to use objects to show them in use, and that is not in keeping with the usual way of thinking about objects, but arguably is a much more educational way of thinking about what's in the collection. The thing that I'm most interested in is, as history museums have moved from the handmade 18th, early 19th century object to the consumer era 20th, 21st century objects. Many objects are no longer unique objects. They're, you can use up an object and buy another one on eBay. And it opens up some real possibilities for saying history museums can be more flexible. You can replace objects in a way that art museums usually can't.
Great, thank you. And Amy, I have a question here for you concerning restitution. And that is, how does blockchain technology offer new approaches to restitution?
Sure. So blockchain technology is often talked about in the context of cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or NFTs, these kind of token structures that are like a Solowit certificate of authenticity wrapped around a digital image. But blockchain itself is a registrarial technology. It's a way of, in the words of Haber and Stornetta, the researchers who wrote a 1991 paper that's cited in the 2008 Bitcoin white paper, it's a way of knowing what is true, of trusting what is true about the past without having to trust a central administrator to keep the record. So what's interesting about blockchain is that it's like any database structure we would use to keep track of objects, except that it can be designed to be publicly verifiable without having to trust an institution. So as part of decolonial practice, if you're trying to bring parties together, that could be source countries, European Museum, if we're talking in the context of the Sarr-Savoy report and the conversation about the restitution of African cultural objects from European museums, you can imagine that having a blockchain record creates some spaciousness in what people are able to negotiate. So you can assign ownership rights back to the source country and then ask permission for exhibition rights for a period of time. You can be gifted ownership rights in exchange for a payment. You could take exhibition rights in exchange for a cash flow payment. So I think there are ways that ownership and generosity and kind of recognition come together. I've written a little bit about this with some collaborators who started an organization called the Art in Antiquities Blockchain Consortium. I'm happy to refer anyone who's interested in that. And Adam and I wrote about it a bit in our essay for this book, because deaccessioning is an interesting framework in which to say, not, is this an object we don't want? Does it not fit in the collection? Do we already have a number of these? But was it maybe never ours to begin with? Or can we imagine like putting it out into a chapter of its life where, based on what we understand now about the history of the object coming into the museum, we wish to return it to someone else? And I think so blockchain can support that because it's an immutable record that is publicly available and can be verified transparently without the sort of power differential that is itself, I would say, a colonial structure of trusted institution and outside party. That's very theoretical, but that's how I would answer that question.
That's fascinating. That just so many things are opened up with this new technology. It's pretty extraordinary. Okay, actually, I think we have time for just one more question here. And this is if we want to open up our loan policies to share our collections with for-profit organizations in order to create an alternative to deaccessioning, what are the pitfalls? And how does that impact our status as public institutions? So, anyone want to jump in and respond to that?
Well, I simply can say that it happens, and but they're often for-profit organizations with exhibitions as their goal. So it's not, Snapchat, meaning, and there have been, it's much maligned, but there have been, transactions of money from for-profit exhibition organizations to art museums for the long-term loan of, or periodic loan of a work, towards an exhibition. So it actually is a way that that operating funds can be addressed. I mean, if you look broadly, I love to, and thinking there's a I've often cited Tom Krenz's part of his revolution was looking at art objects as capital objects, right? And he had a very different point of view given that sense of objects as capital. He actually used his collections to as collateral for building projects, a variety of things that went beyond the standards of the profession. But in the context of looking at collections as capital, a lot of things have happened. Indeed, putting objects towards giving them to for-profit organizations for fee. There's also the capital acquired in places like Lubar, Abu Dhabi, and Louvre. I mean, and where a few $1 billion have gone to the French government for the long-term, shall we say, loan of objects combined with the expertise associated with starting a museum. That Louvre example is not exactly to a for-profit organization, but there is money as part of the exchange, as it might be in the context of it. And it is frowned on, but it's not utterly against every guideline. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston did it very often. A journalist who's written recently on deaccessioning, Sebastian Smee in Boston, used to beat up the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston because all the greatest things were away and not on view in the galleries for the public. But it is a way of addressing operating funds.
And I was going to say, Michael had shared your piece from Curator, the Museum Journal, on these international partnerships. I think is a very interesting lens onto this question, not just of money.
That's not about, it's about money. That article was really driven by a potential alternative to repatriation or a kind of sharing of collections as a parallel act, if you will, to repatriation. And it, could involve money, but there wasn't an assumed financial transaction involved.
Yeah. I guess for me, it's
then
quite
I would-
interesting to take the sort of like transactional revenue question, like, can I rent off this piece to make money? Am I going to get in trouble for unrelated business income tax or some sort of mission violation? I think it's really interesting how to connect that to this kind of writing that you were doing, Michael, and that I think others have been doing as well on these sort of the partnership frame of how to share works and how to think of governmental partnerships, especially in relation to kind of your opening comments about the lack of a kind of cultural government agency in parallel to what you see in a number of other countries.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect note to wrap this up on. I'm just getting the message that we're very close to our end point. But I want to thank all three of you for sharing your perspectives, your experience, your insight with all of us on this fascinating topic. So I, for one, will not think about it the same way going forward. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, bye now.
Thank you.